Hello, I'm Sean Rickenbacker. I'm the director of the J. Max Bond Center for Urban Futures at the Spitzer School of Architecture at the City College of New York, where I am also an associate professor of architecture in the Department of Architecture. I'd like to welcome you all to this presentation for the Livable Cities New York International Conference. I will be presenting today a research work and paper on building a case for spatial reparations, Harlem, a case study for the Architecture, Media, Politics, Society, Track 2, Urban Design and Planning virtual presentation. Now, to begin, I would just like to reference some context due to historical housing segregation practices such as redlining, as well as current ones, such as predatory lending. Many underprivileged communities continue to face various forms of economic deprivation and spatial injustice. These practices have contributed to a prolonged national scarcity of affordable housing and increased displacement as a result of limited land resources, market speculation, as well as other factors. In this framework, modern zoning is a crucial policy that also directs the majority of development practices, and particularly urban housing. However, the findings suggest that zoning and the policies that support it protect and constrain the establishment of important spatial morphologies, resulting in an even more unequal distribution of spatial resources. This is the case in New York City. And in the slide presented here, I just wanted to make the case that in the late 1960s, one of the first community development corporations of which my center has its legacy was actually invested in similar work in examining policies and working on behalf of communities to introduce, in this case, in the case of East Harlem, plans that introduce new morphologies that would ideally contribute to more equitable renewal and development in New York City. Now, the representational methods and procedures that these urban policies indicate and direct create a kind of artificial spatial scarcity, in addition to being discriminatory in practice, and that upholds systemic geographic imbalances in terms of wealth, health, and housing security. These are many of the same issues that tie back to this earlier work being done by the Architectural Renewal Committee. Now, concerns about spatial justice and reparative justice continue to be crucial concepts in identifying alternatives to current policies and modes of production that may provide more equitable outcomes. This presentation will explore how policy reform, coupled with emergent spatial morphologies of housing development, might help shape and materially negotiate new scalable concepts of spatial and reparative justice through a series of analysis and case studies of Harlem. New York's housing production challenges, the housing market's supply side expectations, and assigned zoning policies will all be interrogated and investigated in the process. The talk will suggest an expanded role for these spatial justice issues using investigative policy review and reform, planning, and design. This is a role geared towards encouraging meaningful policy debate and the regeneration and redistribution of spatial resources, with the goal of offsetting or slowing forms of gentrification and building mutualist markets that may be more equitable. Now, the housing crisis is fairly well documented and certainly is where this work situates itself. And so not only in the US, but also in places like Canada, the crisis is pervasive and in part due to the market's inability or lack of production And so available homes, or the number of available homes shown here, falling sharply or steeply across the metro areas of the country. Identification in terms of numbers of the unit shortage and how that crisis is effectively playing out. Now, historically, beginning in the 1930s, in the late 1930s, the imprint of redlining's impact can be seen in the physical manifestation of the communities that they were applied to, as well as within those lending policies. The Homeowners Loan Corporation map shown here of areas of Manhattan used by the FHA not only tell the historic racist policies and injustices, but also explain development patterns through to today, and even forecast the persistence of those current policies as played out, as previously shown, and the housing shortage that we see today. Interestingly enough, there are correlations to be found between the economic deprivation in relationship to the lack of investment spatially, and that these same areas and communities exhibit patterns of low participation in economic activity, particularly in the banking industry, where they represent the highest numbers of unbanked communities. And this is a direct overlay with pre-existing redline communities. Another important factor here is that although in certain periods of time we might see recognizable building activity, particularly in New York City and in its residential sector, there's also simultaneously the undetectable to the public a housing unit loss, most notably in gentrifying areas. So here in Central Harlem, the total number of buildings showing decreases in units of 112, and the total units loss approaching 830 between the years 2015 and 2018. Additionally, our research inquiry goes towards the types of buildings, types of building starts in terms of who's responsible. So the public sector versus private versus nonprofit. And we see that in the 60s and 80s, in the case of Harlem, there were a number of properties raised, but fairly low activity in terms of development starts. And then in the 2000s and 2020, we see that the private sector dominates the creation of housing in general, without particular emphasis on affordability. And then simultaneously, the housing prices in lockstep with housing scarcity, the increases in terms of housing pricing seen here approaching 500% in East Harlem and up to 250, just above 250 in the areas of Fort Greene, Central Harlem, 270, Morningside Heights, also in Harlem, close to 400. We all know that the research points to the fact that changes in median rent are not in line with any kind of change in wages. And so both the change in median rent and the percent of rent burden continue to increase as those wages almost stay flat, and with brief rebounds after lower periods in the 1980s and the 2010. The widening home ownership gap plays a part, or is in part due to the lack of production, along with a host of other factors, but certainly low housing production affects the possibility of making these units affordable, the ones that are available. And then again, the lack of production equates higher prices and rents in general. So one of the obvious spatial disparities that we've uncovered that has direct correlations to zoning is that there seems to be an arbitrary application, whether that application is based on contextual appetite in terms of contextual and scalar changes in a community. But throughout New York City, one can travel just a number of blocks. In this case, the comparison is between 56th Street and 145th Street, showing grave volume and density disparities. And the obvious point here is that each one of these districts is zoned differently. However, one would imagine that zoning reform could attempt to more evenly distribute the spatial resources and or opportunities for more equitable outcomes when addressing the affordable housing crisis. Now, zoning interrogation also points out that the arbitrary application results in a couple of things worth noting. That's a form of manufactured scarcity, which plays into the hands of the market by driving up the cost of the limited supply. It limits opportunity, which also has the same impact, and then certainly has negative impact on affordability due to the increased competition because of this induced scarcity. Now, it has been proven over time that zoning policies have changed in an attempt to be responsive to defined needs. In the case of the Tenement Act, there was building improvements for light, air, and safety. Likewise, 1916 resolution and the 1961 zoning amendments, late 1980s, the post-war neoliberal building policies come into play, introducing things like voluntary and inclusionary housing, in 2016 mandatory. Unbeknownst to many of us who were not perhaps paying attention to the evolution of building typologies with respect to zoning in particular, the super tall, which appeared around the late 2016s, 2017s, was really a play on the financial market, finding out ways to extract new profits out of the limited resource of land that the city now had to offer. And as Samuel Stein points out in his book, Capital City, in the real estate state, the industry trends towards innovation to continue to extract profits which lie outside of current policy. And that would certainly indicate that the super tall fits that description. And here we can see that the instruments utilized here, air rights, efficient use of infrastructure, small parcels of land, effectively produce very favorable return on investment models, and thus the model is catching on. Verticality and height has a lot to do with profitability. And so here, the Turner Construction Cost Index, which takes rents into consideration, and this is within the commercial market. So this index will certainly change in regards to the phenomenons brought on by remote work and COVID-19 pandemic. But it certainly points to the idea that more volume in terms of vertical height does have a strong correlation to the value and profit index of a property. Speaking of profit and returning to Harlem momentarily, the investments that currently do happen in Harlem, those same profits are extracted back out. So this graph is modeled on the premise that many of the development groups are located in terms of their operating addresses outside of the community. And we know that the investments do come from a variety of sources, sometimes even international, and that investment simply does not stay in the community. And so thus the research wanted to examine what possibility could be introduced where that investment stays within the community. Harlem is home to Manhattan's highest rent burden population and some of its lowest income residents. And so in terms of equity and investment, it's a neighborhood and community that certainly qualifies. Innovative strategies have been introduced in the case here of accessory dwelling units. The only exception here is that the majority of this context that we are examining does not have many single family home residences, and therefore the ADU model is not particularly useful or scalable, in our opinion, in the context of Harlem. Now, the current physical form of Harlem is heavily conditioned by land use policies and zoning, and in particular, that's what reproduces these patterns of local urbanization that we see here, rooted in former policies of economic deprivation and isolation, and now playing out as scarcity in a supply versus demand equation, steeped in the logics of capitalism. But within this territory, the goal here to introduce new asset classes and financial instruments, and perhaps that asset class being an attempt to kind of reclassify what property ownership might look like. And so the introduction here of the concept of a bit lot, which is to take a lot of property and sort of subdivide it into smaller bits and make that the new kind of asset class, making it more available to smaller investors, let's say. That same idea in terms of a new form of property and property ownership in the form of bits is described here as bit lot, and then introduced ideally across easily accessible platforms for greater community participation. Effectively, the larger concept here borrows a bit from the super talls, but also examines a condition found in many of Harlem's more smaller neighborhoods and the zoning that's applied to it, which is a residual portion of floor area ratio, and whereby if the city were to incentivize the use of this available FAR and provide bonuses, one could introduce buildable areas above existing properties, avoiding displacement and demolition, and introducing new community assets and perhaps even a new asset class for investor interest. When looking at this holistically across the community of Harlem, one finds that there are over 300 sites that would qualify and are identified in this case. Happy to share a sort of model of how the aggregation process might in fact work. And so the location of residual FAR is identified. We quantify, and the property owners negotiate in terms of level of participation. Some will opt out, some will opt in. And preferred sites will be identified where the FAR that is available can be relocated and approved by some policy reform, and perhaps even city and local participation in terms of the process. And the resultant new form and morphology of the city born out of this process. And so from those processes, one would imagine that the city would enact perhaps policy reform, introducing new rules, various iterations to provide examples of what this might look like at the smaller scale for brownstones, transit-oriented and wide street configurations of existing buildings, building additional residential units on top. Similarly here, in a different contextual configuration, utilizing the bonus, and then a study of the potential units and how those can be allocated for more diversity. Again, in a kind of reparative sensibility where the types of family structures might be more inclusive in this regard in terms of one, unit type and availability, and then affordability, playing into this idea of spatial reparations. A model of the financial resources that might be generated in this regard. And then an overview of how the entire Harlem, West Harlem and Central Harlem in this case, the combined effect of the units could total approximately 5,000, if this were to be examined and applied throughout that community. And in closing, just to say that historically, we've identified plenty of models that introduce a kind of second condition to existing properties. In the case of the mansard, perhaps built all at once, but this model is being borrowed here and heavily leveraged to sort of examine both the historical references as well as future possibilities for more equitable and reparative development opportunities in the case of Harlem, New York. Thank you very much, and I look forward to engaging with my fellow researchers and scholars, and look forward to the publication of the Livable Cities Conference. Thank you very much, and enjoy your day.